Thank you. Just a number of people in this group might be old enough to remember when letters to the editor used to frequently appear signed by members of the Seventh-day Observance Society. They were, hands up if you do remember those letters. Oh God, you're all chickens. Well, I remember them. Certainly, perhaps not since the 60s, but they were there at that time. A couple of people generally complaining about sport, but other issues as well. And just while I was doing my tennis research during last week, I came across this report in 1911, and it reads, "As the request of the Parliamentary and Bylaws Committee of the City Council submitted a draft bylaw in respect of Sunday observance. No person shall play cricket, football, handball, tennis, bowls, croquet, polo, baseball, golf, hockey, quoits, rackets, or any other game, or engage or take part in any foot race, Sheffield, handicap, hurdle race, obstacle race, or walking match, or any combination thereof, or any sports of any kinds whatsoever, or train for racing or other purposes, or exhibit himself in racing or running costume, or train any horse, dog or animal for racing or other purposes on any portion of the parklands, reserves, plantations or squares within the City of Adelaide on Sunday or any part thereof." So that was the state of play in 1911. And there were a couple of people, those who remember back in the 1960s, a couple of very prominent cricketers, one of whom might have played for Australia, Alan Frost, who gave up playing first-class cricket because of the introduction of Sunday matches. And at the beginning of his career, also Andrew Sincock was in that same position where he had to sort of make a choice about whether he was continuing his cricket or not, and probably would have represented some sort of crisis of faith at the time. But yeah, they were a couple of those examples before.
Where's John Hill when we need him?
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Now, there are a couple of issues that have come up during the week. I'll just raise one where Peter's got a microphone, Peter Crossing, that we might just go to some comment, but everyone pretty excited, I suppose, about the Sheffield Shield victory. But in my view, James Sutherland cost Victoria the game. So that's open for debate. In my view, it looked like he bowled about 18 consecutive overs on day 4, and I just couldn't understand it. Did anyone else have that view watching the game? Or?
Oh, I was going to say I watched a bit on the Saturday night as well, and I thought, as you said, he bowled himself far too much. He would have been better off bringing either back Boland or Murphy, who was getting appreciable spin the night before.
Yeah. Well, I was sitting at the TV and I was saying he thinks he's George Giffen. But, yeah, so any other views? All right, doesn't matter. I mean, we won, that was the main thing. Now, also, John Winters just conveyed some very exciting information to me across the table and might like to enlarge on it from a...
I don't know whether any of you watched on Channel 7 last week the athletics, the Maury Plant meet in Melbourne. And the thing that was extraordinary about it was the run by Cameron Myers, who's aged 19, he ran 3 minutes 30 and 42 seconds in the 1500 metres. He won it by a Herb Elliott distance, and it was the fastest run of a 1500 metres by anyone in this country ever. This guy has got form. His name will be ringing around the country in times to come, I suspect, at Olympic Games and Commonwealth Games, because he's just got an extraordinary amount of talent and has done extremely well. As a junior, as a 16-year-old, he broke the world record for the fastest mile. At the age of 16, he took the Australian national under 20 mile record. He broke Jacob Ingebrigtsen, the Norwegian superstar's mile record, 1500 metres and 3000 metre record age for the age group. So I think it's fair to say that we need to watch this space, because this guy's loaded with talent and he's got an incredibly determined look in his eye, and I think middle distance running in this country's in pretty good hands with him for the future.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the members of the South Adelaide Football Club Heritage Committee, who, between them, have produced this fabulous book for the club's 150th year. One of the oldest clubs, the only club to have played in every season of the Sandful so far, the good old blue and white. So, I met these guys a few years ago, and they said they had an idea to celebrate their club when it turned 150. They said they'd never done a book before. They didn't really have much backing from the club at that stage, and they paid absolutely no attention to anyone and went on and did it anyway. So I'm full of admiration for them, what they've done. They've done a fantastic job. So I'll introduce them quickly to you. And what we'll do is I'll ask a few questions of these guys, and then we'll have a period of time where if you have a question you'd like to ask about South, I'm sure that somebody here will help. So David Kelly, to the far right, he's the chair of the committee. Like all of them, if you cut David, he bleeds blue and white. He's also written a really fantastic book called Glory Days about the 1930s, one of South Adelaide's great periods. Craig Pett is next to him here. Craig's an independent author and journalist, lives in Melbourne, and will be the most committed South Adelaide fan you've ever seen. I reckon he comes over for every meeting, and he's done a wonderful job, particularly with the early part of South Adelaide's story, which is very rich and deep. Dr. Randall Williams is here. Randall's seen more of football than most of us ever have, because he's stitched up players, watched them spew up, put them into ambulances, listened to their worries, all that sort of thing. He served as club doctor for many years. He also wrote a very nice book about the Curly era in the mid-60s for South Adelaide. Sitting at the table back here is Dr. Jack White. He's true or false, you were in the rooms in 64? You were? Which is pretty good. And I know he's got a souvenir jumper from Melbourne when Melbourne played South Adelaide the week after the grand final, which is one of his treasured possessions. So if you go to Jack's office in the city, it's a shrine to the Panthers. And last but not least, Peter Alexander's here as well. Peter, you may know from previous iterations, Peter's a long-serving board member, aren't you, on the Sandful Committee and so forth. He's the conscience of South Adelaide, you might say. Nice to have you here, Peter. Thank you for joining us. I'll start by first of all asking David just to talk a little bit about how you went about doing the book, because it is a little bit different. It hasn't been one author, it's been a collective group. You can explain a little about your approach and how you went about it?
Thanks, Mike. Just before I start, Michael played a pretty big part in the book too, so you shouldn't underestimate his efforts either. He bumped us in the right direction a few times. Initially, we started, I think, looking back at our committee minutes, it was almost 5 years ago, we initiated this idea, and Randall was the chair of the group at that stage, and he thought it was a really good idea to do. So we began, and then promptly Randall decided he didn't want to be chair anymore, so I landed the job. So it's been pretty tough, and especially in the early going, I think we really wanted to sort of initiate a book that told the whole story, and that was going to be a big thing because no one had ever done it before. Only little bits and pieces. Randall wrote a book on the Curly years, and Mike wrote a book on 1964. But we wanted a book that encompassed the whole story of South Adelaide. So we got to work, and the book, if you purchase a copy, it's split up into 25-year eras with a different author for every year. So we all went off in our different directions and researched that little era, and we'll all become pretty much experts on that little portion each. So we got to work, and we were sort of bumbling along as we were, and then Craig one night invited Mike along just to give us a few ideas and point us in the right direction just for one night, and Michael stayed for 4 years, which was great, really great. And then another night, or another AGM, or after a match, a random supporter came up and approached Craig and myself and heard that we were embarking on a book and wondered if he could help. And there was a guy called Peter Kiley who he just retired from work, worked for the Port Adelaide Enfield Council. He's graphic designer and an IT guru. So I'm not sure that we would have got the book done without him. And he was cheap as well, very cheap, like zero. So that helped a lot. We had our moments during the whole making of the book. We had some pretty heated discussions at times between us. But we're lucky Peter Alexander came along, and for those of you who don't know Peter, he's a bit like the godfather of South Adelaide. He's a fountain of knowledge of the last 100 years of the club, and he knows everybody and everything, and he steered us away from a few little whirlpools and traps and things that we might get into trouble with. So Peter was fantastic in that regard. We eventually got the support of the club, who backed us financially on the whole deal. That took a little bit of work, and I did a presentation to the board one night and was pleased to receive the big tick of approval. And they're very happy with the way things have turned out so far. There was a lot of pre-sales that we did, and that sort of underpinned the finance of the book as well. Allayed a lot of the concerns that some of the board members may have had. But it's all looking really good. The book's officially launched on Good Friday, this Friday against Port. We've got celebrating our 150th year. The hard copies are almost 2/3 sold out already, but we've got the soft copies are here tonight if anybody's interested. They're selling tonight for one night only at $100. On Friday they'll be $110. So if you've got some cash and you want to catch up with me after, please do. Good on you, mate.
All right. I'm very conscious that Alan Reid is in the room, the expert on constitutional politics, but I'm going to ask Craig to talk a little bit about the early formation of the club, the role of the Kingstons within that, and really the way South Adelaide helped define the way South Australian football went at that time.
Can I just start by saying that David did a great job, you give credit to Michael, but you did a great job managing all the personalities and whatever. And I've got to tell this quick story about David. When he was 6 years old, at the 1964, he'd been to every game. All year he was, blue and white blood. And South made the grand final against Port, big fairy tale occasion, bottom the previous year. All David wanted to do was go to the grand final. And he's pleading with his dad, let me go. And his dad said, nope, all week, nope, you're not going. You're too young, you're too small, you won't see anything. And don't worry about it, his dad said. there'll be other occasions. So, yeah, but the Kingstons, yeah, if I can just summarise this quickly, I mean, South's history mirrors South Australian state history in a couple of important respects. What I mean is, not Charles Kingston, come to him in a second. Charles Kingston, the great Premier, Federation father who founded South Adelaide. His father, George Kingston, Irish-born, worked his way up through the ranks at the colonial office in London in the early 1830s. When the expedition is about to go out to establish Adelaide and the province of South Australia, George Kingston wants the top job. He wants the post of surveyor, but he's a bit too young and inexperienced. It goes to Colonel William Light, and George Kingston comes out as the deputy surveyor. When they get here in mid-1836, of course, William Light is unwell, as he was for pretty much most of his time here, dying young. It was George Kingston who, according to his biographer, there's only one biography of George Kingston written by an academic, a late academic, Donald Langmead. According to his Langmead, it was Kingston who walked into this, where we are now. It was Kingston who found this plateau of land and said, this is the site. And then it was Kingston who did all the work, surveying, etc., etc. Light had a role in it and signed off, but according to Donald Lang, all the evidence suggests it was Kingston. So that was 1836-37. Years later, when George Kingston's older in his 60s, late 60s, and his son Charles has started the South Adelaide Football Club, the earliest surviving document we have of South Adelaide Football Club is from the Minute Book of 1880, and there it is, patron of the club, Sir George Kingston. So some clubs might be proud to have, say, if Colonel William Light was written on their documents, but South have gone one better. We've got the man who did the work. Sir George Kingston, who founded Adelaide, was the original patron of South Adelaide Football Club. And then, of course, his son Charles, born in 1850, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. He was bull-headed, blunt, outspoken. Everybody's familiar with the history of Charles Cameron Kingston. And it's just important, an important point about South history is that South Adelaide was formed in the early 1870s by Kingston in order to bring uniformity, because there were all the clubs around, all these different clubs established by then, but everyone was playing under a different set of rules, variation of rules. There was no consistency. Games were ruined because players were confused about which rules were applied. We had a great game here, but it was also confusing. Kingston wanted to iron out all the confusion. He created South Adelaide on a platform of, we're playing under the Victorian Code, which was more popular, even over here. It become more popular. We're playing under the Victorian Code. We're also going to encourage every other club to play under the Victorian Code as well. Because Kingston, as he did much later in life on a much bigger stage with Federation, was all about bringing people together. He wanted South Australia and Victoria playing the same game. So South led the way. It was through South Adelaide, through Kingston, established in April 1876, that came about. The very following year, the South Australian Football Association was formed only because of what Kingston had done, no exaggeration. And then, within a few years, intercolonial games were happening between South Australia and Victoria, all due to Kingston, all due to South Adelaide Football Club. So I guess the upshot of all this, Michael, is that if a third AFL licence is given to South Australia, should be given to South Adelaide out of gratitude.
Am I right in saying too that the club South Adelaide, and we tended to think of it as the King William Street divides West Adelaide from South Adelaide, but South Adelaide was south of the river, is that right? As part of the Adelaide Football Club, there was the South Adelaide part of it. That's the origin, and they were wearing blue and white. And then Kingston set them up as a separate club.
That's right, Well, yeah, I was going to touch on that on the Sturt point that you might mention. But yeah, that was the Adelaide Football Club, established in 1860, which was more of an association arranging colour matches between its different divisions, but other clubs eventually formed. The Adelaide Football Club, which had emanated out of St Peter's and was therefore unprivileged, Peter Alexander can talk at length about this when you get him up. The Adelaide Football Club was all about England. It was all about the homeland, really. It was playing more of a rugby game. It was out of St Peter's. The Kingstons didn't like that. They wanted an Australian game. And the Adelaide Football Club in the early 1870s fell out of favour because the rules under which it was playing, which were a bit more like rugby, were unpopular. All the players wanted to play the other sets of rules. So from 1872, the Adelaide Football Club couldn't field a team. They're gone. They did revive a bit later, but they were gone. So there was no city club. So that was Kingston's opportunity. He said, we need a new city club. So South would have been called Adelaide if that name had already been taken. But the next obvious name was South Adelaide, which was the city just on the south side of the river. But that's South's identity in essence for the first 100 years, city club.
All right, we're going to fast forward to the 1960s, and Randall, I'll bring you in here. One of the ideas the guys had for this book too was having written 25-year sections about the 150 years. The back part of the book has a lot more features, more about players, characters of the club. There's a wonderful reflection of Randall's on being a club doctor. There's a terrific essay by Craig about home grounds and heartlands and so forth. And I want to ask Randall to explain the story and the importance of the Skelly family in Kent Town and how they helped win the 64 grand final.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yes, the Skelly family lived in Kent Town and used to take in boarders, usually country people, but who would come down to the city and want somewhere to stay for a couple of days. And they were approached in the early 60s, I think it was by Max Murdy of South Adelaide, could they take some of South's country recruits? So they could take up to 5 at any one time, and in about 62, 63, probably the most famous of those boarders was David Cantilla, who had come down from the Tiwi Islands and was to become a bit of a legend of football in South Australia, and in fact was best on ground in the 64 Premiership. But there was also Dick Jackson from the, I think, Port Pirie, Jerry O'Brien, Mick Rivers from Broken Hill, and I think Brian Roberts from down south. And Kent Town was an ideal place for them to board because at that time South were really centred around the Adelaide Oval and Kensington Oval, and they had a recruiting zone in the eastern suburbs as well. So these country recruits were made to feel very much at home at Peter and Betty Skelly's boarding house, and were looked after by Betty Skelly more like a mother, really. And young John Skelly, who was about 10 or 11 at the time, grew up with these players and idolised them, particularly idolised David Cantilla, would shine his boots before games and so forth. But in trying to track down the story of the Skellys, because it played a big part in the 64 Premiership, I managed to track down John Skelly, and after quite a lot of... he was sick for a while and I couldn't get on. Finally I met him for coffee and got the full story. And he still had David Cantilla's 1962 Nucky Cup, which David had given him as a present when he went back to Darwin. And with a little bit of persuasion, he was happy to turn it over to the South Adelaide Football Club. This was last year. And it's now sitting in the trophy cabinet in the foyer area of the club. But John was very happy to tell us all about it, and it represented a fantastic period in his life when he grew up and idolised these players who went on to win the premiership.
Can you also imagine trying to feed David Cantilla, the Whale Roberts, Dick Jackson on every night? Some of you may be aware that South Adelaide have a catch cry, Yeo. You ever heard that? Old Southies have that Yeo. David, can you tell us how that came about?
I'll reference a former historian at the club, John Althorpe, who was, many of you probably know. He wrote an article about this a few years ago, and I've got a copy of it at home. Back in the dark ages when horse and cart were the means of transport for everybody, South would meet at a meeting point in Victoria Square to go and play at Alberton, and there'd be a horse and cart arrangement, and all the players would sit on an open cart. Off they'd go with 3 or 4 horses or whatever pulling them along. So they'd go on their way to Alberton, and about halfway along Port Road, the Woodville Hotel is there, and right behind that there was a stable where they used to change the horses. So they'd drop the horses off there, tie up some more horses to pull them on the rest of the way to Alberton. The horses, in the meantime, be watered and fed, and then to change them over again on the way back. Anyway, the name of the stable was a bloke called Yeo, Y-E-O. And upon approaching the stables, the players on the back of the cart used to yell out, Yeo. And that's how South became known as Yeo. The trips to Alberton were quite adventurous, because as soon as the siren sounded, the players didn't shower or anything. They just jumped on the cart and head back to the stable, because 6 o'clock closing at Woodville Hotel was a bit of a rush.
Now, South Adelaide could have been Sturt. That's the story. You paying attention? This could have been your club. All right. So, Craig, you did a lot of research. You did a lot of research on this, and this is around the time of electorate football. Yeah. Can you explain?
Yeah, it's a good story. So 1897, I think it was, might have been 1898, when the electorate system is being formulated, South are offered, well, not offered, I think they were pretty much told, it was at the very least an offer, you've got to go down to the electorate of Sturt. Now, in hindsight, we look at that and think, well, why the hell didn't South take that up? What an offer. But when you put yourself in South's circumstances at the time, and the 2 leaders of the club at the time were William Green Coombs and Frank Marlowe. So, in context, South were the most powerful and popular club at that time, ahead of Port and Norwood. In the 1890s, we won 6 out of 8 premierships. Should have been 7, if not for umpiring in the 1897 grand final, when they wanted someone else to win, and Port got on the line, over the line. And there's an interesting story about the McGarry medal, but I won't go there. So South are they're the club with the most gravitas in the 1890s. Not only that, but they've also, as I mentioned before, they've created the whole thing. All due to Kingston, they started and created the whole thing. But they were so powerful in the competition that crowds were dropping off. It was too much about South. South were smashing everyone. So they bring in the electorate system, which was effectively to blunt South Adelaide. That was the main purpose, was to bring South Adelaide down to size. Now, the South officials that I was talking about, Coombs and Marlowe, they halfway acknowledged, the fairness thing, but they were filthy as well, because the club that was getting hit 100 times harder than any other was South. South, it was written in the papers. You look it up on Trove. The club that is going to suffer the most from this by far is South Adelaide. They will become a cellar dweller. So South were already wounded really badly by this electorate system, and they were fighting against it, arguing players should be able to play with whichever club they choose. So that's the situation. And then the association say on top of that, oh, you're going to go down a Sturt. And Coombs and Marlowe were saying, you've got to be kidding. You know, our whole essence, our whole identity is the city. We are a city club. That's what we are. First of all, you've ripped the heart out of our chest with this electric system, and now you're telling us we've got to go down to the bush down there. And one of the lines, this is written up in the papers at the time, one of the lines from Frank Marlowe, he says, we are South Adelaide, not south of Adelaide. Right? We are South Adelaide, the city.
What did that cost them? What do you think making that decision not to go to Sturt, what did it cost them?
Oh, well, long term, well, not even long term. I mean, within only about 3 or 4 years, South were desperately looking for more territory. So that's why it's a decision that's easy to criticise. Yeah. So in the end, the club said to them, to the association, in paraphrasing, they said, well, you can stick it. We are staying right here in the city. And of course, the population in the city was dwindling year by year. So there was a very small talent pool to draw on. And from about 1903 or 4, South hit rock bottom and stayed rock bottom until the 1930s, which was David's specialty. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to mention that because you know about the 30s. There's an old gag, isn't there, that South always do well in the Depression. So 1890s, 1930s, that's their yep. Any economic downturn, let's go Panthers. So how did they overcome it? Now, you had a stat, didn't you, about the 20s, which was something to the effect of they couldn't recruit anyone. And the only players, there was sort of like 10 players that played more than 20 games who came from their zone. That's how much it crippled the club. How did they overcome it in the 30s?
Yeah, look, I just want to add something to what Craig said. When the electric system came in 1900, was it? I think
1899.
No, 1899. By 1903, because when the electric system came in, what happened was South had a cracking side, you know, and Craig mentioned that. Really good side, but overnight, not next season or the season after, the players that were playing for South were redistributed to the other clubs. So by 1903, every other club, except for Port Adelaide, had a South Adelaide former player as their captain coach. So it ripped the heart out of our club, absolutely. I'll get on to what you said now. So from 1900 to the early 20s, South had a pretty lean run. They were stuck in this little compartment in the corner of the CBD. They were getting flogged every game. There was questions over their very existence. So South tried recruiting players from other clubs, all this sort of other stuff, but that involved arranging their residences and all this sort of stuff. So it was too hard. And consistent pleas by the club to get a change in the zone just fell on deaf ears. So Sturt came in 1901, is that right? And South were vigorously against that. Glenelg came in 1921 and they got a great big swallob of where they still are today. So between South still, we had a good side in the early 20s. We had a bloke called Treadray, Moriarty, a really good side, but underachieved in a couple of years and bombed out in the finals. But by 1925, Moriarty and Treadray had both retired, and South were in desperate straits financially and had no players of any consequence at all. So between 1925 and 1934, every other club in the SANFL won the premiership at least once, except South. And South had, you won't read it in their biographies, but Shine Hosking coached South Adelaide for a year. South didn't win a game. McGregor, Bruce coached South, played a couple of games for South, didn't do any good. So we're only winning maybe 1 or 2 games a year between 1925 and 1934. But South had some really good local support from businesses in the city. John Dunn had the Producers Hotel. Jimmy Brown had a furniture store in Hiney Street. Herman Men's had a factory in Wakefield Street, or one of those streets. Yep. And so they all got together with Mr. Green, and they decided, what are we going to do? We're either going to have to close the doors, or what are we going to do? So they decided what they were going to do, because there's no country zones. They were going to scour the countryside, invite players down for pre-season. Mr. Dunn would put them up in the producer's hotel and give them a job pulling beers in the bar. And Jimmy Brown would put a couple of blokes working on the floor selling furniture in his shop or whatever. So they found these blokes jobs and somewhere to live. And they come down, a lot of blokes came down and didn't last very long, couldn't hack the city life, so off they went. But gradually, from about 1930 onwards, South started to build, a couple of good players here and there all the way. And they stuck around, which was the most important part. So come 1934, Frank Golding from Sturt coached South, and South started to think they're going to have a reasonable side. And they won the first 2 games of the season against Port and Norwood and lost every other game for the year. And Frank Golding lasted 1 year as a South coach. So it was an interesting year, 1934, because even though South finished bottom, Glenelg finished top. Max Murdy, who was runner-up in the Magarey Medal 3 times, as it turned out, South player, young fella, he was runner-up in the Magarey Medal that year. Jack Coburn, who was a new recruit from Blythe up in mid-north, he came down, he finished 3rd. Diddy Munro, South full forward, kicked 80-odd goals. Clem Rosewarne, who we collared from Glenelg, because we found out he was actually living in South Zone, he came across and he kicked about 60. South had, I think, 5 or 6 players in the state side in 1934, and we still finished bottom. So anyway, Mr. Golding, see you later. And we've got a bloke called Vic Johnson from Port Adelaide, who was the state captain, premiership captain at Port Adelaide, and very well respected fellow in footy circles. He came and coached South. And in 1935, with a team which had 14 players in the 20 in the grand final, 14 of them were from the bush. So that tells you something about the little city zone we had. So where Coburn won the Magarey Medal in 35, South won the flag bottom to top in 35, and Diddy Munro kicked 115 goals, including 7 in the prelim and 5 in the grand final. But it got better after that for a few years, because South played, after a big long drought, we played in 4 grand finals in 5 years, won 2 of them, probably should have won 3. And that was a second little golden period for South, which got stopped abruptly by World War II. But we were lucky. It was one of the very few times that South have had we've had great players over the journey, but only 1 or 2 at a time. But we had about 7 or 8 really cracking players in that era, really good players. So, yeah.
Should mention that the tiny city zone that you did have did get you Jim Dean, who was pretty handy, as from what I understand. He was probably, he was a bit later on. Randall, I want to ask you about your time as club doctor. Yeah. Was it 20 odd years? 20 more than 20 years you were there?
Well, I started in 1972 when I was a very young doctor.
What was it like? Tell us what is the role of a club doctor in 1972?
Well, probably similar to today, except that we have had some major advances in medicine over that time. For example, when I started in 1972, there was no CT, there was no MRI, there was no ultrasound really, and so most diagnoses of injuries had to be made clinically or with X-rays if there was a bony injury. And starting off in 1972 with South Adelaide, I'd grown up idolising people like Peter Darley and Lindsay Backman, and I was actually able to meet them and be in the inner sanctum of the club, which was fantastic. The coach at that time was David Darcy, a very good coach, of a good player, but just did not have the players at that time to be successful. But I think the better players at that time, when I started, were were Darley, Backman, Coombe, and Mark Coombe, and those sort of people. Jim Harley was the main club doctor and had been for many years. You'll probably know the name because his grandson is Tom Harley, who was the Geelong Premiership captain and is now high up in the AFL. Jim unfortunately died prematurely of prostate cancer and didn't ever get to see his grandson play football. Back in those days, club doctoring was probably patching up players, suturing, reducing fractures, dislocated fingers, assessing concussion, that sort of thing. As I say, much as it is today, except that we now have these wonderful scans that can quickly diagnose and tell you exactly what's wrong with a player, whether it's a ligament, or a muscle, or a bone. One thing I would like to mention, because I think it's interesting, is the taking of fluids. Now, you will remember when teams did not drink during exercise. It was considered a no-no. And it was considered that you would get abdominal cramps and vomit and all this sort of stuff. And the result was that in football particularly, players would get severely dehydrated during games. And there were a couple of grand finals. One was, I think, played in 37 degrees or 100 degrees Fahrenheit back in the day. I think it might have been even West Adelaide in 1961, yes. And players were actually physically ill after the games and after the game because they just weren't allowed to drink. And the compromise was to have orange and lemon squares or wedges, and they would suck on those at quarter time and half time and three-quarter time, and three-quarter time became known as lemon time for that reason. But around about the time that I started, there was a big move to drink fluids, and it was shown that you could actually absorb clear fluids quite well, even when you're exercising. And that had not been understood until that time. And it really came out of the work of the Florida University football team, the Gators. And they formulated this sports drink which became known as Gatorade. And that's where the whole thing, they've allowed their players to drink this stuff and their performance went up dramatically. And as a result, gradually that filtered through to around the world, so the players, as we know now, players are drinking continuously during games, before, after, and much better condition when they finish a game. Now, there's lots of things I could talk about, but that's probably...
Can you talk about Bill Bennett and Ray Hayes?
Oh, Bill Bennett and Ray Hayes.
Does anyone know that story?
Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, my voice is going. Bill Bennett was a very tough ex-Carlton VFL player who came over to play with South in 1972, I think. And he quickly became established as a key player. He was a key position player. He could play centre-half forward, centre-half back, kick goals. He was rough and he was tough. And we were playing one of the early games where I officiated as an umpire, as a club doctor, sorry. We were playing Port on the Adelaide Oval. And it was when Ray Hayes was playing for Port, and I think he eventually went to West Adelaide. And Bill Bennett, they decided Bill Bennett had a standout first quarter. He had, 10 kicks and 3 goals and was looking ominous. And I think Port decided that they were going to stop him. And Ray Hayes was quite a well-known, vigorous player, shall I say, at that time. And Bill was running towards the half-forward flank at the southern end of the oval, grandstand side, so we could see it quite clearly. And he had his head down trying to paddle the ball up, and Ray Hayes just came straight at him with his knees into his head. And Bill Bennett was out cold, and he didn't wake up for nearly 20 minutes. And he actually had a convulsion on the field, and Jim Harley and I ran out there to try and see what was going on. Eventually, we transferred him to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and he did recover. But I think, I observed him from that time on. I don't think he was ever the same player. And it was an early illustration to me of how bad head injury can affect a player. I don't think he really ever achieved his potential with South as a result. And after a couple of years, I think he went off and played elsewhere.
Have we got that other microphone for Jack White? Are you able to hand it down? Because I want to ask Jack a question about Rick Davies, because the jumbo went to South, didn't he? Because Sturt said, you've had enough. The jumbo went to South. Now, so Jack White is a psychiatrist, is that right? Psychologist, excuse me, specialising in sports psychology at times. Can you tell us a story about the work you did when Rick was coaching South Adelaide and the result, particularly, was it a night game?
Yeah.
When you were asked to do a little bit before the game?
Yes. Rick came to South after Don Scott showed his skills after six matches and no wins, and the club decided that they needed a change. And Rick was, at that stage, I think Don Scott had. I won't steal your side there. I know you can talk about Don. Yes. Anyway, I was asked by the club to look after Rick because we'd heard he was a bit of a lad, and anyway, it was quite a challenge. And I won't go into some of the stories because I think I'd probably get sued. Anyway, the following year we were playing in the final of the night series. I think it might have been the Escort Cup, but it could have been one of those other names. But South were playing Glenelg, and one of my tasks as the sports psychologist, I was doing some relaxation exercises before the game, and the plan was fairly simple. I'd get the players relaxed and focused, and then Rick would come in and go through the strategy of, the game plan, etc. Unfortunately, those of you who know Rick, he was asleep in about 2 minutes, and there was nothing I could do to wake him. It was just prodding him and pushing him and pricking him and doing everything. And I knew what the plan was, so I ended up giving the pre-match address. And finally he falls off at the end and, oh, what's going on? What's happening? I said, look, we've got to get out there now. We've finished the... what did I say? I said, don't worry, you did well. Anyway.
Did you win?
Sorry, a long story short, South won that game, and David Bertelsmere, who was the CEO at the time, came to me and said, Jack, we've got a coach. That's why we pay a coach. We don't pay a fucking psychologist to talk to the players beforehand. So, fuck off.
Can you give Peter the microphone? Peter, a bit of a question without notice for you, Peter Alexander, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Noarlunga, because one of the narratives of South is that in many respects they've been quite baseless. They were at the Adelaide Oval for a long time. They had this constricted area that they were in. They didn't really have the proper zones. There was the move to St Mary's, Panther Park, which didn't have that, and then the move to Noarlunga. Can you talk us a little bit now about Noarlunga, been there now for many years, and how that has changed the idea of the club and how, the true South Adelaide club and the home they found there?
So in 1995, the club went to Noarlunga, and that followed that period at St Mary's where they didn't play a league game. So those bad decisions which come out of the book, whether you like it or not, you've got to be honest, there's some terrible decisions taken with the best of intent. I'm sure you mentioned Marlowe and those guys in 1899, the introduction of Sturt, and then South and Westies. I use Westies because they're the two city clubs that stayed, many would say, too long in terms of the population of the city. The Fire Brigade was very significant and all those types of things for both clubs. But the decision to go to Noarlunga was the first time, and John Reid picks this up in his introduction to the book, it's the first time that South have had an area since the one that was mentioned by Craig back in those early days of federation, because they didn't stay at St Mary's. They stayed at Adelaide Oval, which was really a great place and romantic place to play your football, but there were no people in the area who were significantly involved with the club. So the move to Noarlunga has been significant, and John picks this up in his introduction. He quotes Foss Williams as telling him as a schoolboy that you've got to love your local club. Norwood, Glenelg can identify with that. Port Adelaide. Where was South Adelaide in 1950, 1960? So, cutting to the chase, Noarlunga is the first real home South have had over that 100-year period in terms of young people who come through the system, a Horn Francis, these type of boys are locals who go on through South Adelaide because they come from the local district. So, in terms of the club's survival, without the decision to go to Noarlunga, again, you'd remember the survival issues. And so Noarlunga's a plus. You know, they own, they're debt-free. I just like saying that about South Adelaide because they haven't been debt-free very often. They're debt-free. They're developing young players. The women's competition, they're doing really well in. There's young players coming through the system. And so Noarlunga has given them that identity of a local club, finally. So that sort of picks up that history a tad.
So do you want to...
I'll just go back to what Jack was saying about Rick and Don Scott. Just let you into one of our meetings we had. You know where this is going, don't you, Michael? We were all sitting around the table and talking about who we're going to talk to, who we're going to get information from, who we're going to call, all this sort of stuff. And Michael he's the interloper, he's from Glenelg, we're all blue and white people. Michael suggested, has anybody ever spoken to Don Scott? And there was a deathly pause, and we all sort of looked at each other, no. And Michael said, do you mind if I have a chat to him? And I said to Michael, you go ahead, you do your very best, but I wish you luck. Anyway, so off Michael goes. About 2 weeks later, on a Sunday night at about 10 o'clock, Michael texts me. He said, I've just had 2 hours with Don Scott. And it's in the book. But it's a very vanilla version of the events. Yeah. Severely edited, I think you could say, Michael. Michael edited the book, by the way, too. I've got to mention that.
No, Don was very good. Don was very interesting, and I think there was a lot of misinformation about the time he was in Adelaide, that's fair to say, and a lot of misunderstanding of it. He's a pretty headstrong guy. But what was interesting is after having spoken to him, he continued ringing me for several weeks afterwards. I would look and the number would be there, and he would be driving his car with some random thought about the AFL interchange rule that he wanted to get off his chest or something. So I'm not sure how many mates Don's got. But no, that's not a fair thing to say about him. He was very, very interesting, and he remembered a lot about South, and he remembered it fondly. And a couple of hot takes from it. He never got paid. They did win a game when he played. Yeah. So they played a night game against West Adelaide Football Park. Remember they used the old Escort Cups or whatever they called them, pre-season game. South are going all right. He thinks, oh, this is not bad, pre-season. Doing the job in West, he said, geez, we're going well across back too, like we seem to have the ball on a string. And he looks down, he sees one bloke sitting on the interchange bench. So he starts going like that, and he realises they've got 19 players on. So he says to the runner, go out and bring so-and-so off straight away. And the runner says, well, who do you want me to put on? He said, don't bring anyone on, just bring him off. He said, what are you bringing a player off for? And he said, disciplinary reasons, get him off. So he reckons they had 20 minutes with 19 players, got the chocolates over Westies and no one noticed. So they did win. They did in that one game. But they had a really bad day at Port Adelaide, and he blew a fuse at half-time in the rooms. He acknowledged that. There was a players-only meeting on the Monday that suggested that there was a lot of disconnect between the playing group. He had a plan of what he wanted to do. He wasn't getting there, became frustrated and he left. But the interesting twist to it was that he had played at Hawthorn with Rick Davies. And he approached Rick, because Rick got sacked by Sturt. And he approached Rick and he said, would you come over? Because he said, not only do you be a great full forward, but you understand Hawthorn. You understand what I'm trying to do here. And Davies wouldn't do it. And then when then Scott left and got sacked, and Rick came, probably because he wanted to be the coach. I don't know. I've not spoken to Rick about that. But he felt, Don Scott felt that if he could have got Rick Davies, then that he, you know, that would have sorted it out a bit for them. So that's the way it is. He would have had him at full forward and he would have known the Hawthorn system. I mean, Don Scott said he felt he needed at least 12 months with the group for them to start to understand what he was trying to implement.
My question, I don't care who answers it, but as a teenager, South Adelaide were always very good in the night series matches at Norwood Oval. They won a few titles, used to performed quite well against the Waffle and VFA teams, and I think even one night they played St Kilda over at Waverley and gave St Kilda a good contest, and yet South Adelaide in the normal sample season were only a medium team at best, but under Hayden Bunton they seemed to play night football really well for quite a few years. Does anyone have any theories as to why that was the case?
Panthers a nocturnal animal. This was my excuse. I was at a lot of those games at Nord, actually. I think Hayden Bunton was coaching then, and he introduced a style of game that was really much play on, move the ball forward quickly at all costs, and that probably helped under those conditions, I guess. But South won 2 night premierships.
Yeah, 79, that's when Central Districts were minor premiers and missed out and you made it. But something interesting, when Centrals came in 59, the reserves, and when they were ready to go to the league in 64, there was strong talk that they'll be South Adelaide. We're going to go to Elizabeth. But and Centrals only got up by 1 vote at the league office. Otherwise, it would be South Adelaide playing at Elizabeth. So it's not many people know that. So we're brothers in arms.
Yeah, no, we've got that in the book. I stumbled across it through reading the Central's Palms to Premiers.
You've met me a couple of times.
Yeah. Oh, Robert, I didn't recognise you. You had a haircut or something. Yeah, but that's how I found out of it. So it's in the book, yeah. But Plan B, if Centrals didn't come in, no, the vote was either bring Centrals in the, or if that failed, South get kicked out to Elizabeth. Yeah.
And Craig, something interesting is when we met in Adelaide. I didn't have to go to Melbourne.
No, that's right.
And also
at the railway station.
Your cousin is a big baseball player.
Brendan, yeah, Brendan.
So,
no, he's my. You corrected me on this. He's my cousin's kid.
Yeah, so he's your cousin once removed.
Right.
Yes, we had that argument 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Just on that point about Centrals, there is another South connection there in that in 1963, when Centrals were due to be admitted to the senior competition the following year, a player called Malcolm Whitford went out to Centrals to help them get ready. And Malcolm Whitford had been a premiership player with North Adelaide, but he had fallen out with the North Adelaide hierarchy and left the club. So he went out to Centrals and helped them to prepare, and I think may have even played some of their reserves games. And his classic comment to me was, he taught Gary Window how to kick. But Malcolm was actually an incredibly beautiful long drop kick. I don't know how many people would remember him. But he, at the end of that year, the beginning of 1964, he just happened to be having a drink in Neil Curley's pub, and with no plans to go back to football. And Neil Curley approached him and said, "Would you like to come and play with South?" And he played with South for 3 seasons or 4 seasons. Didn't actually play in the premiership, but he was, he just couldn't quite crack into the league team in the finals. But that was another connection with Centrals.
Just a little personal anecdote. When I was, I guess, about 10, late 1950s, I used to go to a gym at Highbury Street Methodist Church. And after the gym session, often an old bloke on a bicycle would pull up with a sugar bag full of Jerry Nolte, who in later years I thought, I'll find out a little bit more about this guy. Found out he played for South Adelaide in the early 1900s and was a champion cyclist.
He used to wear the hoop jumper, didn't
he? Yeah. and had a bicycle shop with a fella called Martin in Rundle Street, which probably may have become Super Elliott's, I don't know. But just a memory that...
Yeah, Jerry Nolte was well known in the outers of the clubs, and he used to hand out apples and oranges to children, and I think you'd probably get arrested for it today, but in those days it was okay.
Just a quick question. I've been doing research on Kensington Oval in between 1945 and 1963. That was the period where Jim Dean was playing for South Adelaide. I'm just wondering if you've got any inkling as to why he won so many McGarry medals, given that he was in such a poorly performed club at the time.
Never saw him play. I was too young, too old, whatever. But before my time, unbelievable player he must have been, because, as you say, South over that 1950s was a very ordinary team, winning 1 or 2 games a year. Dean won the McGarry medal in 53 and 58, but he was also runner-up 3 times. And there were other blokes in the other clubs like Lindsay Head, Len Fitzgerald, Bob Hank, all these other guys running around who were winning games for fun. But South couldn't win a game. In about, I think, for 2 years, I think he went to play for Richmond in the VFL. And Jack Dyer was the coach, and Jack Dyer thought he was the Ducks Guards. He must have been a great player. Ducks Guards. Haven't you heard that before? You need to get out more, Craig. The other thing about Dean is that his son, Michael, is today a Kingstonian. He's tied up very well with the club. Never turned out to be as good a footballer as his father, though. Never mind.
I have a question for Craig there. Our early Sturt teams, 1901, are filled with South Adelaide players, right through to 06, Percy Keckwick and those, and we get the great Taffy Way who wins the medal in 03. It was incredible to see how many South players come to Sturt from South. Yeah. And the other moment in my life, I had coffee one morning with 2 great South Adelaide players, Peter Darley, the original Jumbo Prince, and Rick Davies. And I interviewed Rick Davies for the book on 1976 Sturt's premiership, and Peter Darley gave him a piece of advice. And Peter Darley said to him, "Now you be a good boy, Rick, not one F word to this gentleman." And Rick Davies was good for an hour.
On the first point, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that was just an effect of the electric.
Just one point I want to make, mentioning Jimmy Dean. For anyone who hasn't read it, John Althorpe wrote an outstanding biography on Jimmy Dean called The Larrikin, in which he not only looks at his time in South, but it's a great social history of living in the East End of the city, and then follows his career all over, from not only his play with South, but going to Richmond, going to the Ovens and Murray League, where he actually gets paid more than the double twin Brownlow medalist Roy Wright, and this sort of thing, and then going up and playing in Perry and so on. So a wonderful book. But just one question for the panel. You talk about the loss, of moving out of the city. When I was working at the league, Don Roach used to say to me, the clubs that were then powerful, this is in the late 70s, early 80s, were Port, Sturt, Norwood and Glenelg. And they all had a strong arterial road, or in the Port's case, Black Diamond Corner and surrounds. They all had a real sort of heartbeat in the suburb. The other clubs, a lot of them, didn't, Prospect didn't have the identity that it's got now along Prospect Road. And certainly other clubs like West Torrens might have had, I suppose, on Henley Beach Road, Richmond, there was nothing here. South had nothing, of course, in terms of a geographical identity. And but in the days when it was a city club, and then of course it was divided with West, we know a lot about West's identity. What was South's identity in the which street was it?
Well, that's the perfect question for Peter. Can I hand that one over to Peter?
Oh, you've done a lot of work on it too,
Peter, Peter's grandmother managed and owned the Orient, right? That was Bessie McCoy. And Peter grew up, this is in the southeast pocket. So the Alexander family, sorry? And Margaret Nolan grew up there, Jimmy Dean grew up there. So Peter Alexander's family, he grew up there, it was intrinsic to that part of town.
We were saying to some of our West colleagues a bit earlier tonight that Westies still maintained a higher population, the western part of the city, but the actual break was King William Street, believe it or not, one side or the other. Now, South Adelaide had that southeastern corner where Jimmy Dean and those people, Panizza, I can name a few players, but Westies still had, I'm comparing the two city teams, Westies still had a big population. The Sturt Street School, all of that great history around there. South had, I think, Mike, we talked about this, they had one school, Christian Brothers College in the early days, and they did very well out of that, Moriarty, those sort of people. But at that time, the area was really, and particularly you mentioned the 50s, after the Second World War, people didn't live in the city. And South and West, unlike Fitzroy and South Melbourne, stayed and survived. I used the comparison with those two VFL teams who didn't survive. But South had that challenge of trying to do it from that very small pocket of the city. And it was pretty hard to exist. It's not a good story.
Yeah, further to that point, my grandmother was born in Regent Street in the city in 1895, so she just missed really the golden years. But in 1985, as a 90-year-old, and she was bedridden, blind, I used to have to go around to her house and put the radio on to the channel South were on every week just to hear her South Adelaide play. And it was when Don Scott was coach. I find it quite poignant and just how much a football team meant to people in that time. Was Jimmy Dean from Regent Street the next generation? Yeah. He is Vincent Street, was he? Yeah. But it's, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, Regent Street back about a bit closer. But as I said, I always found that. And the other thing, I've read in 1907 there were moves to merge West and South. How close did that get?
Yeah, I think it got pretty close. I think it was more. I think that it was a push for South and West to merge for several years. I think it went on for about 5 years, and it was all along considered an insult to South for the reasons I touched on earlier, by people like Marlowe and how dare you interfere with the identity of South Adelaide. We've won 6 of the last 8 premierships, and here you are telling us we've got to merge or move to Sturt, or we created this whole thing, and now you're treating us like this. And it was that resistance which eventually won the day. And I love that story about your grandmother. That's fantastic.
If I can just add to that fabulous story about your grandmother. Jimmy Dean told me, and perhaps Bernard's question picks this up also. Jimmy Dean told me that when they won that 35 and 38 premiership, he was only a boy. And he can remember the people singing in that southeastern part of the city when South did have that identity. And that always stayed in Jimmy Dean's mind, that he could remember when the local area was that southeastern corner and they won those 2 premierships. And he had great memories of it.
All right, we're going to have to wind it up. Is that right? Or you want more?
Just going back to the 1890s, the story I love most is there was a rule in the SANFL, or whatever they were called in those days. South was so dominant, and Norwood, I think, made the initial appeal. They said, look, they're too rough. and it was agreed that South were too rough. And so for the season, they were asked, if you want to play South, you can, or you can have a forfeit. And that's what actually happened. And South didn't make the finals that year simply because the majority of teams said, no, we're having a forfeit.
I think we must thank Mike and the panel and Jack and Peter over there for a wonderful contribution. We could be going on all night, but we actually want the people here to sell a few books. I don't know how many you brought down. Or if you haven't got your money tonight, certainly go out and buy it. But great presentation, brilliant interviewing by Mike, and of course our thanks to everybody. So can you put your hands together, please?
The official launch of the book is on Friday down at Noarlunga. Peter Daly will be there, John Reid will be there, Brad Gotch will be there, heaps of other people will be there. And it's $60 a head for your drinks and cocktail food. So if you can make it, that'd be really great. I just want to quickly say one thing. Sorry about this, Bernard, but anyway. A lot of people ask me, who is the greatest South Adelaide player ever? And I've done a lot of research, and it's a bloke you've never heard. Well, a few people have heard of. A bloke called Jack Reedman. His story is absolutely unbelievable, and you might hear a little bit more about him in a few years' time, I think, because I think he deserves a lot more recognition than he got. He changed the game, and he was more or less the mastermind of South in the 1890s. He played Test cricket for Australia, captained South Australia at cricket and football, saw South to 5 of their 6 premierships, took North to 3, and West Adelaide from bottom to top to champions of Australia in 1 year. And in his spare time, he was a champion long-distance swimmer. So he played baseball as well. And he was lured back to South to coach for 1 year in 1912, with generous offer of a bicycle so he could get to training.
And Wayne Lawrence has almost completed a biography of Jack Reedman. So if you don't know Wayne Lawrence, perhaps it's right alongside John Lyssicardis there, which is very exciting. So and I believe he's worked with you a bit on that, Craig, and other things. Also, just one of the dirty players there for South Adelaide during their period was none other than Ernie Jones, who I've written a biography on and put a chapter on his football in there. But and Jones actually considered that he was a better footballer than a cricketer. Okay, all right, see you next month.
Thank you.